Hey, this is Lee and this is Leighton, and we have our second episode today with Ana Kasparian, political commentator, YouTube host, uh, political analyst, and the publisher of a new Substack, the Unaligned. Um, I've watched you, I feel, for the last 12, 13 years on various shows, mostly on the Young Turks, so great to have you here.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here. I was just thinking about how, I first came across Leighton's work when you were over at Brave New Films,
Yeah.
Leighton.
hmm
And I was thinking about that specifically because of the fact that, Kamala Harris is campaigning with the Cheneys, Liz Cheney in particular, and Brave New Films, was really at its heyday in the middle of the Bush era when neocons like the Cheneys were totally gung ho about pointless wars and all of the intervention garbage that we were getting ourselves into and now continue to get into under the Bush Biden administration. But it's just things have devolved so much
Yeah.
since then.
Yeah.
It's so
I mean,
depressing.
like Jon Stewart cut his teeth on attacking the Bushes, and now it's like Colbert's entire platform is just given over to promoting Kamala Harris.
Hmm.
It's a different world. And
Well,
then,
Yeah, it's tough.
the reason I think I, I I want to speak for you guys, but let me know if I'm wrong. I assume that all of us kind of gravitated towards independent progressive media because the establishment media was so differential to the Bush administration, to the arguments for the war on terror, for endless war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and and so forth. So now it's like, okay, to be establishment media, I mean, to be independent media is again kind of being outside the bubble. It's just now it's the Democrats who are pushing the same kind of ideas.
hmm
Yeah, totally. And it's even worse than that because now independent media is pretty much falling in line with Kamala Harris's decision to align with the neocons. Then you look at the right with Donald Trump, and there's really no safe haven. At least back then, there were some feasible solutions to the issues that we were seeing. There was a place where like minded individuals could come together and share their ideas. And now there's even fracturing within that previous group of people, right? Where, some of them are falling in line with the now mainstream Democratic Party and their friendliness to neocons and some, right wing foreign policy ideas that I absolutely detest. I just, this is probably the worst I've ever felt about our political landscape. And I don't really see any silver linings or light at the end of the tunnel, not to be a total doomer about it. But maybe it was just my youthful optimism back in the day, and that's completely faded away these days. But that's just where I'm at. And I don't know what the appropriate answers are. You have corporate media, legacy media, they have all of the various flaws that we've always been critical of. And then even with independent media now, there's a lot of behavior going on that, and a lot of commentary and allyships that I just don't understand at all.
And if you're willing to name names, who do you have in mind specifically in terms of? I don't mean individuals. It could be outlets or whatever. But
Right.
Can I just say Mother Jones? Like,
Hmm.
oh, there's that.
I
Yeah.
used to read Mother Jones religiously, and it was a reliable source of information that was critical around the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan. And now it's like we've got a lot of wars going on right now. Where's the commentary?
Yeah. I mean,
It's, yeah, go ahead, Layton.
I was going to say, The Nation, I have not, I mean, I haven't read that magazine in years, but my assumption is that it's probably throws out kind of token critical arguments about Kamala Harris because that's their brand. But then for the most part, it's just anti-Trump stuff. So
Hmm.
like, yeah, it's the left-wing media that has kind of just gotten into line. And I suppose that was a complaint of ours even back then, like under George W. Bush, that the left wing media, got in line with essentially the Democratic Party. But the Democratic Party at least had a left flank back then.
Yes,
Mhm.
exactly, exactly. And I find myself in this very strange place where, I specifically note in my Substack that I identify as unaligned because the political labels really don't make much sense anymore. You look at the Democratic Party and I think that something very intentional happened. I know it sounds conspiratorial, but I think, in the Bernie era of 2015, 2016, there was a real opportunity for the Democratic Party to pursue some of the economic proposals that he was putting out there, right? He obviously spent a lot of time talking about our broken healthcare system, and he pursued a single payer system. Even if we didn't accomplish that and at least got a public option, that would have been a massive win. But that movement, unfortunately, morphed, and I think very intentionally so, with the help of neoliberal Democrats, into the social justice type movement that really had the economic policies on the back burner. That wasn't really the number one priority for them. And so there was the focus on intersectionality and supposed criminal justice reform, which was really just, abolitionists in sheep's clothing. Like, it was just so obvious to me. And they have, in my opinion, squandered a really great opportunity to do something that would universally improve material conditions for Americans. And they did that because they wanted to pursue, very fragmented, like race-based policies or, social justice policies that actually ended up leading to a lot of backlash. So, Vox has a piece right now that I think is really on the money about how progressives went from playing offense to now playing defense because they have lost quite a bit of influence within the Democratic Party. And I think that's part of the reason why you see someone like Kamala Harris, running as Republican light or a moderate who's very friendly with neoconservatives and disenfranchised Republicans.
No, that's right. It's just kind of like a shell that she's filling. We've had the last decade of this billionaire funded, and the big kind of open secret on the left that the right sometimes exaggerates. They at times use conspiracy theories, but there's a big nugget of truth there that there are about 7 or 8 major billionaire foundations, multi-billion-dollar foundations, Carnegie, Ford, George Soros, but many others, not just them, the Pritzkers and other billionaire Democratic donors who set the agenda for the Democratic Party and even the progressive left, because a lot of these kind of activist groups, these organizations that lobby on specific issue areas, they all kind of get their funding from the same places, the same big foundations. And when they set the agenda on this kind of narrow race-based or identity-based politics that's often divorced, as you mentioned, from working class or economic concerns, or at times even working actively against working class concerns by making their lives worse in demonstrably materialist ways. Now that there's such a backlash that these ideas have failed, they haven't worked, they've actually, if they haven't hurt people in a material way, they've caused incredible amounts of backlash because they've created this kind of artificial racial divide where, well, we're not supposed to care about poor white people in Kentucky and Appalachia because of their skin color. It never made sense. There wasn't kind of this solidarity, unified democratic working class politics that you saw in the 20th century, or at least earlier part of the 20th century. And now it's like, what are you going off of? Just hoping to have this Dick Cheney coalition for bipartisan cred, where it's like, okay, maybe there's a cynical partisan play where it's like you want to get these these voters who are turned off from Trump. I get that. That's fine. But then you have no positive agenda for foreign policy. So if you're just a voter curious about where Kamala stands, you're kind of filling in the blank. Maybe she stands with the Cheneys. It's not actually implausible when there's no other actual plan for ending the war in Ukraine or what to do in the Middle East.
Yeah.
It's unfathomable.
What you were saying about Bernie Sanders, it's like, it's interesting when you look at the trajectory of Bernie. It's easy to look in retrospect and discern sort of a plan where there might not have been an actual plan. But like in retrospect, you're like, Bernie came out of the box hot and was like taking on the Democratic Party, had this class-based politics. And so between his two campaigns, you have 2016 and then 2020, he'd been completely neutered by sort of the response from the how do I describe it? Like the woke branch of the Democratic Party, which was really the centrist part of the Democratic Party masquerading as like political radicals. And then 2020 comes and he's completely domesticated. He's like, he's afraid of his own shadow. Like everything's about diversity and inclusion. So it's meaningless. It's like it has no appeal to anybody, and it peters out. And now Bernie Sanders is just like a good Democrat, stumping for Biden, stumping for Kamala. AOC, same thing. She's just like a gateway drug for young progressives into the mainstream of the Democratic Party. It's like the in retrospect, it does feel as if it's like the woke moment was like a deliberate, conscious, brilliant strategy.
It was. It was.
To just neuter like the class-based radical elements of the left and bring them into the neoliberal
Yes.
center of the Democratic Party, and now they're aligned with Dick Cheney.
It's so true. I mean, it's funny because I remember Cenk and I having conversations about this, not on air, but privately, because, as this was happening, we didn't have the evidence to make our case on air, but we're like, this almost seems like a conspiracy by neoliberals to kneecap the left flank of the Democratic Party. Because think about it. Okay, let's focus on California for a second. In California, the activists that we're referring to like played right into what the neoliberals would want, right? Now, what would neoliberals want? They would want to cut spending on social programs, and a government-funded social program, whether people want to see it this way or not, is our criminal justice system. Mm-hmm. So you have Gavin Newsom, basically pandering to this group by shutting down 4 state prisons without any plan of what to do with the inmates who had been in those prisons. The plan was, okay, we'll just transfer them over to county prisons instead. County prisons are overcrowded, and so they just end up releasing people, including incredibly violent criminals who have been found guilty of homicide, who have been found guilty of rape, releasing them before their sentences are up. No rehabilitation, because that would require funding, obviously. And so obviously the crime rate is going to increase in big cities like San Francisco. I know that, the violent crime rate has actually decreased in San Francisco, which is great. But that's not to say that the conditions on the ground have improved for the majority of people who are dealing with antisocial behavior, who are dealing with property crimes, dealing with their cars getting broken into again and again, open air drug markets. The violent crime rate did increase in Los Angeles. It only decreased very recently, but we have very similar issues to that of San Francisco. And what is that going to lead to? That's obviously going to lead to backlash toward the progressives. Mm-hmm. And so no one trusts them anymore. I don't trust them anymore, right? Because they don't really value the economic policies, the universal policies that would actually improve the lives of everyone, including, by the way, disproportionately people of color, the Black community. But it's not good enough. You have to have the racial branding if you're going to pursue any policy, because that is what they want to stand for. And it's just frustrating because now we find ourselves in a position where there really isn't an option for people who want those left-wing economic policies. Kamala Harris isn't going to pursue it. Obviously, Donald Trump isn't going to pursue it. Donald Trump has some interesting takes on, tariffs, and people get real upset at me when I say, in some cases, targeted tariffs do make sense. Mm-hmm. And I can't even believe I'm saying this, of the 2 candidates, I watched the hour-long Bloomberg economic talk that he had last week. He's clearly thought about economic policies far more than Kamala Harris has. And that is so depressing, so incredibly depressing. So yeah. I don't know what to make of it.
I mean, the contrast there, I feel like Kamala is not a stupid person. That's kind of the insult that's hurled at her, but it does feel very thin. It's very like talking point laden, emotional language. It's never very policy heavy. It's not very convincing, but just back to what you're saying, Anna, about California, I want to ask you a little bit more about that. But I think about this a lot because sometimes I complain about the progressive left or the Democratic Party in California, and I sound like I'm talking like a radical because things are perhaps more extreme here in California than, say, maybe Connecticut or Maryland or something. Mm-hmm. But it just so happens that many of these trends catch on first in California. You have a lot of the political party base in California. So what happens in California then follows to the rest of the party. And you see, it's not just Gavin Newsom and the political elite here, it's a lot of the corporate power base. Silicon Valley, when there's an attempt here on the state level to get them to share some ad revenue with content creators, with publishers, they paid some front groups that accused that proposal of spreading hate speech and misinformation. It's this kind of these buzzwords that are now very effective. You see them everywhere in the Democratic Party. When there was an attempt to get Uber and Lyft to allow some worker organizing with rideshare drivers, they paid groups to call that racist because then Latinos and black drivers would somehow be shut out, which is, of course, not the case. When there's efforts to reform our property and commercial property tax code in California, which people don't know this. We have very high sales taxes, very high income taxes, but like almost a medieval commercial tax property situation with Prop 13. Try to reform that, they call you a racist. So it's taking this language from the social justice left to the point where none of these words seem to mean anything. They're used by the oligarchs, by the people in power. And it took me, I have kind of had an incremental march here from writing for The Nation, writing for kind of more institutional left-wing outlets to, I still have a lot of these values. I have a lot of these beliefs and concerns, but I feel I'm with you. The Unaligned is a great Substack name, by the way, because I feel unaligned. Could you talk a little bit about your journey? Like what were there certain moments where you said, what's going on here?
So a lot of different things happened. And, I think there's this misconception that a few things happened to me personally, and that was all it took for me to, have a reactionary response. And that is not the case. Those personal things that happened to me forced me to come to terms with some very real flaws that I was seeing on the left. But honestly, I think that I was just trying to avoid it, pretending like these issues didn't exist. And then once those issues slap you in the face, you really have no choice but to come to terms with what's really going on. And so I'm just going to be 100% honest. I mean, I remember when the BLM protests began in 2020. Obviously, in the beginning, I was very supportive of those protests, but every night they would quickly devolve into riots. And I remember messaging with friends, even messaging with colleagues about being fearful because, where I live is very close, like walking distance to, a main boulevard where a lot of the rioting took place. And on one hand, here I am in my personal life, seeing the injustice of all of these small, in my community, Latino-owned businesses being completely crushed. They lose everything, right? And of course, there's this BS excuse of, oh, they have insurance, who cares, right? Yeah. But no, it's not that simple, okay. But, watching my own community fall apart and then going on my show, and if I'm completely honest, like terrified of even bringing any of that up because I understood the injustice and agreed that something needed to be done about the injustice toward George Floyd and individuals like him. But I was also terrified that if I brought up things like riots, I would automatically be assumed to be some sort of hateful bigot or racist. And I'm just not. I just see the damage that's being done to my community and communities across the country as all of this is going on. So I dealt with that conflict for a little while, and I felt pretty disgusted with myself because I want to be honest with the audience, but there was also some self-preservation involved because I didn't want people to do to me what they're doing now, actually. And then finally, it just got to a point where I couldn't take it anymore. Like I saw what was happening and I needed to be honest about it. Obviously, things happened to me as well. But more importantly, there was a disconnect between progressive policymakers and legislators and what their constituents wanted. And they just ignored their own constituents. A perfect example is Representative Ilhan Omar from Minnesota. So her district demanded that they do not defund the police. Okay, the Black community said, we don't want you to defund the police. There is a higher crime rate. We are worried about it. We do not want you to cut funding for police. The vast majority of them did not want that. Okay. Ilhan Omar went forward with advocating for defunding the police anyway. And I was just like, okay, well, who are we representing here? Are we actually representing marginalized communities, or are we just representing what our cause believes to be right, despite what those communities
Can I point to
desire?
another example that's even closer to home for you, which is, which I just think is wild, is like, do you remember about a year ago in Glendale, there were all these parents who were
Yeah.
protesting the gender curriculum at Glendale public schools, and Glendale is a largely Armenian, but also just immigrant based community. It's like, probably middle class immigrants. I had I did go down and report on it. I didn't take the time to talk to these parents or anything. So this is just casually observing as a news consumer. But whatever you think about their critique about the curriculum, these were just parents protesting what they saw as as the shortcomings of the education of their own children. And like Gavin Newsom, Adam Schiff represents Glendale, doesn't he? He represents Pasadena and I think part of
Yes.
Glendale. They're
Hmm.
like going on Twitter and calling them fascists and comparing them to Nazis, and I'm just like, it was just, to me, it was like flabbergasting, because I was like, these are your voters. Like, and if you've ever been to spend any time in Glendale, you understand that it's safe to assume that like almost every one of them was probably a Democrat. Like, there's
Hmm.
no Republicans in Glendale. They're probably moderate Democrats. And I was like, it's gotten to the point where like you have these activists setting the agenda so forcefully that
Hmm.
the Congress members of these families in their own constituents, their own voters, are inclined to like throw them under the bus and call them fascists publicly. It's just, I found that to be a real like mask off moment.
Well, there's this interesting dynamic at play, and I certainly kind of fall into this category to some extent. But, when you look at the Armenian population in Glendale, they might vote Democrat, and they might totally agree with some of the, left-wing economic policies, but by and large, they are, for the most part, socially conservative.
Right.
And
As
so
most immigrants are, or many.
that's exactly right. Now, I'm certainly more liberal on social issues than Armenians are on average, but what they were concerned about is something that I think a lot of parents across the country are concerned about, which is, having the ability to parent your own child and make decisions about, what's best for your own child. And so I'm not a parent, but I can imagine finding myself enraged over the idea that if my child does identify as transgender, well, the school gets to decide whether or not I find out about it. And you can't, on one hand, say that transgender kids have a disproportionate amount of transgender children commit suicide, for instance, right? There's a higher risk for suicide among this population. So there's that argument being made. And then you have the argument that parents shouldn't be informed if their child identifies as transgender and starts transitioning. And by the way, I mean, there was a huge issue in the state of Florida where one school district did hide the fact that one of their female students thought that she might be transgender. They hid it from her mom. And, luckily she's okay, but she did attempt to commit suicide. And so the mom ended up suing the school district. It was a big deal in Florida. I just think you need to allow parents to be parents
Mhm.
and make decisions for their own kids. I can totally understand why parents would be very upset about that. The other thing I'll say is it is different from a child identifying as gay. It is.
Oh,
Because
Yes.
we're talking about identity, we're talking about their outward appearance, we're talking about certain social pressures in a liberal state that might even encourage something that a child doesn't really identify with. I am worried about that because I do see how extreme some of these activists can be. But either way, I think your point remains. Are these politicians working on behalf of the electorate, or is the electorate supposed to work on behalf of the politicians?
yeah.
Hmm.
Um,
I wonder about the money and politics side of this too. Like
Mm-hmm.
you had for so long all these well-funded gay rights groups, HRC, GLAAD, many others. There's half a dozen just in California. That is they're they fought a very laudable cause for a very long time, and they were kind of the preferred donor entity for many wealthy people in this country. And they won so many victories. They've kind of won everything on gay rights. Not every single thing. I guess there's still some housing issues, but pretty much gay marriage, non-discrimination in most places. And then they were just kind of left with these gigantic war chests of money, and they were looking for a new issue, and they went hard on an issue that's just so much more complex too than gay marriage. We don't have all the science. We don't understand the gender dysmorphia issues that people, for some of these kids, it's just a phase. For many of them, it's just a phase. As you mentioned, the social contagion. We don't have the full research yet on the impact of some of the hormone blockers and the surgeries. We just don't know, right? And I kind of get frustrated when I look at these kind of defend trans youth campaigns, and then you look at the footnotes of the report, and they can link it to hate. In the top line, it's hate speech and misinformation on social media, and then you read the footnotes, and it's they talk about trans people being murdered, and in the notes it shows like a 40-year-old man killing his ex-lover in Louisiana.
Yeah.
Like, what was this? Was this a result of a Donald Trump tweet, or was this the result of maybe just a very different cultural milieu in Louisiana that does deserve attention, but it's not the top line where they're blaming, Republicans in California. Like, it just there's no connect there. There's no precision. There's kind of very broad campaigns that are done in ways that are in effect very harmful.
Well, there's a lot of manipulation, and that was also part of how I ended up identifying as unaligned, because I realized that, I have a lot of guilt. Like, I've opened up about this because I feel like I allowed myself to be manipulated, and I didn't dig deeper, and I espoused views that weren't fully informed. And so for people who think like, oh, Anna's doing a pivot to the right, I'm not even a right winger. I'm not doing a pivot to the right. But for people who argue that, I mean, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I've been very clear about how horrible I feel about myself and how I'm trying to right my wrongs. But anyway, a lot of the data that's put out by activist groups obviously is going to be flawed. Obviously, it's going to be biased. Obviously, it's meant to manipulate you into believing a certain reality so you go along with what their agenda is. That is what they're supposed to do. They're activists.
Stop.
Yeah. And I was dumb enough to kind of go along with it without questioning it, because I had fully bought into one side is good, one side is bad, right? The right wing, bad. Left wing, they want to improve everyone's lives, right? We want to increase equality. We want to root out discrimination. But it turns out that no, there are, activist groups who espouse things that are not rooted in reality, not evidence-based. And I'm not just talking about, the whole youth transgender medicine thing. I'm making a broader point about what I'm noticing. And, I totally got hoodwinked with the defund the police movement. No. It's not actually about defunding the police. It's about ensuring we have more. I repeated that garbage, right? But it was about defunding the police. In fact, it was actually about literally abolishing the police in certain cities across the country, right? Right now, we have a city council member running for a district in LA County who was asked about, hey, I'm an abolish the police kind of person. What do you think about that? And she just proudly declares, F the police. We have a police shortage in LA, and it's a big problem. Like, you'll call the cops when there's something serious happening. If someone breaking into your home, you'll call the cops. They won't show up for 2 hours. And I'm pissed. Like, I am pissed about all of this. And I don't care what anyone calls me. I don't care if they think I'm a right winger. We are still paying the same amount of taxes, and we're getting far less. Our public safety has been kneecapped because of these garbage movements that have forced, certain police to decide to take early retirement, that have discouraged new recruits from even pursuing policing. And so that shortage is going to take, I don't know how many years to fix, but we are suffering the consequences of it. And I absolutely loathe anyone who thinks like, oh, you're being hysterical, and oh, look at these statistics. These statistics say that crime is down. Yeah, fuck off. Okay. I live it every day. I see it every day. I'm not buying it. I know what the manipulation is all about.
I mean, the three cities we all hail from, San Francisco, Oakland, Los Angeles, the proof is just there. You have to be a partisan to close your eyes and not see it. It's demonstrably different from 10 years ago, 15 years ago. The crime, the property crime, the violent crime, the slower police responses, the way that people walk at night, they don't feel safe. Even if, yeah, the homicide rate is lower in San Francisco, violent crime rate's lower, property crime's still sky high. And that still affects people. You know, you can't open a small business if it's constantly vandalized.
Actually, it affects them more. There was a Charles Fane Lehman did an interview with Ezra Klein where he pointed this out. He's like, you know, the homicide rate, if it's high, it still affects a very small proportion of people. So it's not like you read the news and you get scared, but it's not like you feel it when you walk out the door. Whereas all these other social disorder things impact everybody, right? Like public consumption of drugs, car break-ins, the stuff affects you. See it all the time, and so it actually affects you much more. And then, and I want to speak to Lee's point about the HRCs and these activist groups running as businesses. There needs to be like a term for this, because I don't know what the word is, but there's this like, so in San Francisco, in Oakland, in LA, but especially in San Francisco, there's this thick layer of this nonprofit industrial complex.
Yep.
And it's filled with like radicals, right? They're like, they posture as radicals. They identify themselves as revolutionaries. They're extremely militant about their causes. But like I before I was at Brave New Films, I was working for SEIU, and back then I worked for the private sector local, but the public sector local was waging this big campaign where they were going and organizing all these nonprofits in San Francisco and throughout California, but I was in San Francisco at the time, organizing all these nonprofits because city jobs were being cut and outsourced to these nonprofits, right, as like part of a budget cutting process. It was a fiscal austerity measure. It was neoliberalism, right? It was like we need to shrink government and subcontract it out to the private sector to run it. That was what was happening, and all these nonprofits came up to fill the gap, and they were non-union, and they had they had less worker protections and lower wages, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a big problem for SEIU, and they had to go and organize all these places. And I was like, we acknowledged it as such back then. We were like, taking these city responsibilities and subcontracting it out to nonprofits is privatization, and we're against that. But if it's going to happen, those workers should be union. But now it's like we've forgotten about that, and the nonprofits are like, I'm like, it's still neoliberalism, but the theatrics are that this is like kind of some kind of revolutionary communist movement of these, you know, college-educated social workers taking city workers' jobs.
You're absolutely right about that. I've been, raising alarm over the nonprofit industrial complex because I'm pretty furious about it for the reasons that you just mentioned, right? The austerity component to it and the way of outsourcing, government jobs and unionized jobs to these private nonprofits. But the other part of it is they've literally stolen from us. I mean, we pay among like the highest taxes in the country. We spent $24 billion on the homelessness crisis in 5 short years, and all of that money gone, squandered. All of it was funneled to these nonprofits. What did they do with it? It doesn't take much to audit these nonprofits. I mean, just look at their financial filings. Look at how many dozens of people within these nonprofits literally make, of course, the top executive will make 400 grand or more. And then you have dozens of other people making 6 figures at least. And what have they shown for the money that we've given them? What have they done to actually help the homeless? Obviously, there's also been a lot of stories, headline after headline, of these nonprofits who finally did get audited. And it turns out they were taking the money, taxpayer money, padding their own pockets with it. Mm-hmm. And it's infuriating to me because I don't actually think these radical groups care about the issues that they're so militant about, because they don't actually do anything to alleviate those issues or solve those issues. They use those issues as a branding exercise in order to get the money from federal grants, and they do nothing like substantive with it other than, enrich themselves. And the fact, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry.
And the fact that self-identified leftists provide cover for them disgusts me. Absolutely disgusts me. And by the way, in LA, there was a ballot measure. I voted no. I even wrote about it, where they wanted to increase our sales tax by 0.25% in order to help the homeless. Okay, a regressive tax to raise more money to help the homeless, which obviously, like, no, who's going to trust them? Who's going to trust you guys to actually do the right thing with that money? Hell no. I voted no because I want an actual plan. I don't want some bullshit about how we need to raise more money for the homeless so someone like Karen Bass can funnel that money to her nonprofit buddies.
Yeah, I mean, we just have so many similar issues in San Francisco. Everything you're saying applies so equally to where I live. It's just, at least for, for a for-profit government contractor, there's no illusions about what their purpose is. It's like, oh, you're trying to make money. You have these metrics. If you don't meet the contract metrics, we can get rid of the contract. But these nonprofits seem so much more embedded into government because they have these euphemistic slogans and titles, and just by calling themselves a nonprofit, it kind of hides the ball. So like a distraction. It's like, oh no, we're just like government. We're here to serve the public, even though they don't follow the necessary paperwork, even though they have these sky-high salaries, just like a for-profit, and just less accountability and way more kind of, I don't know, PR to kind of ingratiate themselves into the machinery of government. And for me, I voted for the big homeless tax in San Francisco. I think back in 2018, we now spend highest per capita, maybe in the world, but definitely in the country. And you gotta go back like you're doing right now, and it's my own mea culpa. It's like, look, I think we do have this crisis. It needs to be solved. But you look at the way the money's been spent. It's gone into these opaque nonprofits that have not worked. It's gone to programs that seem to incentivize homeless. It's gone to housing programs that have not really built any housing. Some of these groups that are receiving this money from this chunk of several $100 million of taxpayer money, they're against shelters because they say it's not really housing if it's only a 30-day shelter. So they actually lobby against homeless shelters.
Yeah.
Like,
no, it's the perfect grift. It really is. It's the perfect grift because what they want to do, what they purport to want to do, is not something that can be accomplished, right? Or is incredibly difficult to accomplish and would literally take decades to do in order to build enough housing to provide permanent, housing and all the services necessary, because a lot of these people struggle with drug addiction or mental illness. It's just not going to come to fruition, and they know it. And so it's the perfect grift because they perpetuate the problem that they make money off of.
That's right.
And so at some point, the voters, and this is why I'm willing to come out and deal with the insane abuse that I've been dealing with for the last year and a half, 2 years. I want things to get better. I'm tired of voters having their money stolen from them. I'm tired of our taxes going up to absolutely no improvement in anyone's life. I'm just so sick of what I see as the very intentional weaponization of race in order to carry out the grifts that they carry out, right? Because if anyone speaks out about this, what do? They'll immediately accuse you of, hey, you hate the homeless, oh, you're a Karen, or you hate, various marginalized groups, you're racist, whatever. Go ahead and call me whatever you want. I'm sick of having taxpayer money stolen from people in the highest tax state in the country. I'm sick of seeing all sorts of people from all sorts of demographics living and dying on the streets. I actually would like a solution. For me, the financial health of nonprofits does not reign supreme. I would like those nonprofits to be dismantled entirely.
Yeah.
Abolish nonprofits.
To go back to my favorite theme of today, which is neoliberalism dressed up as political radicalism. The housing first doctrine, which is what these nonprofits and these activists espouse, I've done a lot of reading and writing on this. It is the reason why we have housing first as our policy in California is because we shut down the mental asylums for many good reasons. They'd become these cesspools, but there was nothing to replace them. And so the normal path, the normal course of events, if you have untreated mental illness or severe drug addiction, is that you have a psychotic episode in public. Somebody calls 911. You get put in you get put in an ambulance. You're brought to the hospital. They stabilize you. Maybe they put you into a psych unit for 72 hours on a 5150 hold. They stabilize you, and then they have nowhere to put you, so they put you back on the street, and it's
Yeah.
extremely expensive for the city. It's also a political liability because people are seeing this madness in front of them, and that's unpopular. So, housing first is a way to take people with these incredibly complicated, intractable problems and just putting them behind closed doors where they can continue to have their drug habits. They continue to have their psychotic episodes, but nobody's calling 911 because they're safely in an SRO somewhere. The voters aren't seeing it. It is like, it's the most cynical. And so, like, I talked to, for example, this guy in San Diego one time who worked for what was the name of it? It was one of the big homeless shelters, and he just became utterly disillusioned with it because his job was to go and talk to veterans on the street, try to get them to housing. You know, he'd get to know some of these veterans. They had these incredibly tragic problems, these just meth addictions and schizophrenia. And like once, and so he was sold on this continuum of care idea that you get them into stable housing and then you can open up services for them and get them addiction treatment. And he was like, it never happened. You get them into a room. At that point, the nonprofit's job is over because that's all they're contracted to do by the city. So they check off the box, and then they never, like, he'd call these people and they wouldn't call him back. He'd just completely lose track of them. Sometimes he'd see them back on the street again because if you take somebody who's living on the street for 5 years and you put them into an apartment, like he was telling me that some of these people would pitch. They're like, is it okay if I pitch my tent in the apartment unit?
Yeah.
Because they just were not used to being behind, like, indoors. But eventually they would leave again and they'd go sleep on the streets for two reasons. First of all, it's what they were used to when they're mentally unstable, and second of all, because they'd go into withdrawal and they needed to be, you know, within a few minutes of a dealer to be able to deal with that dope sickness. And
Totally,
so it's like,
yeah.
completely doesn't address the problem, but it's also not. It's like this idea that this is some sort of like radical, holistic solution to drug addiction, untreated mental illness. No, it's a cost-cutting tactic that cities pursue in order to just kick the ball down the road and cut down on their budgetary costs and hide the problem from voters.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great point. And cost cutting, I think to some extent, that is a true outcome or intention. But there's also, it's a paradox because there's also an issue of putting someone or people who have severe mental health issues, severe mental health illnesses. And I'm talking about things like schizophrenia. I'm not talking about depression or anxiety. Like, you know, my detractors will claim that I'm trying to, like, you know, institutionalize them for their anxiety. Okay. But there was this one nonprofit that had operated out of Los Angeles for decades, and they would place people in housing. They'd received grant after grant to do so without any real problems, but things started to get a lot more difficult in recent years because of the uptick of drug addiction and also the prevalence of people struggling with severe mental illness. And so you put someone with a severe mental illness in a unit, in an apartment building, without the appropriate mental health care that they need, well, they're going to destroy the unit or they're going to set it on fire. And so all of a sudden, this nonprofit that had been operating for so many decades went bankrupt. And, you know, housing had been destroyed because housing first isn't the right approach for everyone. You know, when you think of homeless people, I think a lot of people in this country tend to think of like a single mother with two kids who has nowhere to go. And that's not really a full picture, a comprehensive picture of what we are seeing on the streets. There are a ton of homeless people in Los Angeles who are not living on the streets. They're living with friends or they're couch surfing. You know, those folks, certainly a housing first approach makes sense. But for the people who are living out on the streets, I mean, you see it with your own eyes. You see it in the various studies where they've, you know, done statistics on what percentage are addicted to severe drugs or have severe mental illnesses. And that is the population represented on the streets. And so this notion that you just throw them in an apartment unit and everything's going to be okay, obviously that's not true. That has not worked. And the difficult thing is, you know, Gavin Newsom, of course, came out with this whole care court thing. I don't really know if it has any real teeth. And I do know that the state legislature has kind of kicked the can down the road because they don't want to really deal with this difficult question. But on one hand, you have, you know, Gavin Newsom being right for once in his life about how, look, some people, they do need to be institutionalized. They can't make decisions for themselves, and it doesn't make sense, and it is inhumane to leave them out on the streets. But then the other side of the argument is the ACLU, who feels that institutionalizing someone against their will or without their consent, you know, goes against their civil liberties. Now, look, that's not to say that the ACLU doesn't have, you know, a good point to some extent. But what if you're dealing with someone who literally does not have the capacity to make a decision for him or herself? What do you do about that? You just allow them to die on the streets? You allow them to commit a crime that's so heinous because of their mental illness that they end up getting prosecuted and thrown in prison for the rest of their lives? Is that the humane approach? These are difficult questions, and I think there's a lot of cowardice because no one's willing to, you know, do the work and figure out what's the actual best approach. How do we move forward in the best possible way?
No, you're completely right. I've just, you know, I have some experiences in my family and with people I know, and just by living in San Francisco, I think about these issues a lot. And of course, there's a, you know, a very valued, principled issue around, you know, not having a state that abuses involuntary holds based on accusations of mental health. But at the same time, there's nothing more cruel than leaving someone who is suffering through, you know, bipolar, schizophrenia, one of these very severe illnesses, leaving them on the streets to harm themselves or others. And that's so clearly happening to thousands of people in San Francisco, probably tens of thousands of people across the state. And the fact that you have billionaire donors funding these groups that are actively lobbying against getting these people help that they need, I mean, that seems cruel. That seems inhumane. And it gets back to the statistic thing I was mentioning earlier. You know, you look at the way that these activist groups, very well-funded activist groups, have used a battering ram to kind of emotionally blackmail society into getting onto their agenda with these kind of cooked up stats. You know, on the trans youth stuff, you look at the studies and you can tear them apart just by looking at the data they use. It's the same thing for homeless. You know, one of the main taxpayer-funded activist groups here in the city, they put out this survey every year. And the news media all picks it up, and they always claim, oh no, the survey shows that the vast majority, like 2/3 or something, of the homeless in San Francisco are people that lost their housing. These aren't drug addicts or people who are, you know, from around the country or, you know, mentally ill. This is part of the housing crisis. But then you look closely at it, it's self-administered survey, and they gave out gift cards, and it's from these, and the people administering it are the most ideological, extreme people in the world. It's like, no, you look at almost any other study of San Francisco, you don't get the same results. And if you have eyes and you've walked around and just talked to people, you know that's not the case.
They also asked,
I think it's the Coalition for Homeless, but that might be the same thing.
So they were part of it, but they literally asked, the question that they asked people is, where was the last place you were housed? And so they're like, and if they say San Francisco, then they're like, oh, so you were housed in San Francisco and then you were evicted, and so you're a native San Franciscan who's been victimized by high housing costs. This is like, what that includes is like, if you move here from St. Louis and you sleep on a friend's couch for a few weeks, because I think what they said was like, to be housed in San Francisco means that you were in one residence for like 3 weeks or something. So you can couch surf on somebody's sofa for 3 weeks, and you have a drug habit, and you moved here from St. Louis because there's no better drug market here, and it's much easier to live that life. And then you end up in a tent on the street, and you're considered a native San Franciscan who's been priced out of housing. And then the other thing, like for people who are not from California listening to this, I think what they don't understand is that, so like the civil libertarian argument, which I think we all would acknowledge there has a very firm moral basis to it. Obviously, things that happened in the 20th century around institutionalization, there were huge excesses. In California, in order to be conserved, which is the only way that you can be held for longer than 2 weeks. So there's a 5150 hold, which is 72 hours, 5250 hold, which is 14 days. And after that, you have to be conserved. And in order to be conserved, you have to be shown to be either a violent threat to yourself or others, or what's called gravely disabled. And so the first step of that is that the psychologist, the discharge planner at the hospital, interviews you. and you have to be incapable of sheltering yourself, feeding yourself, or clothing yourself. And so they ask you, what's your plan for these things? How are you going to get shelter? How are you going to get clothing? And how are you going to feed yourself? And if this is like no exaggeration, if you answer, I'm going to go to Target and I'm going to boost some clothes. I'm going to go pick food out of a garbage can. And I'm going to sleep on the streets, and I'm going to, then I'm going to steal some goods in order to sell them for more food. So if that's your plan, and this is like routine, like you talk to these people and they're usually pretty straightforward about their circumstances. They're like, boom, discharge. Back on the street.
Look, the neoliberals won, and they did so with the help of progressives. That's the way I see it. And it makes me so angry. And those same progressives will turn around and they'll accuse people like us of being like secret far right, alt right, racists, or whatever it is. And it's like, no, you guys exploited an opportunity to actually do something good for your own purposes. And some of us actually see it for what it is, and we're actually willing to talk about it, and they can't stand it. That's the way that I see this whole situation. And it's so deeply frustrating because now you have a financial crisis in LA. It's so frustrating because it's not like we have this issue in California where people aren't being taxed. People are being taxed. There's a tremendous amount of money and resources that gets, funneled to state and local government, and they've squandered all of that. And they squandered it. And while they did it, it led to backlash to, in my opinion, the sincere left that wants to find real solutions to these issues. And so now I think the pendulum is going to swing. In fact, it's already swinging to the right. And I don't know when we'll ever have an opportunity to fund mental health programs that would make the situation better, improve our healthcare system, which I think would make the situation better. If I hear the phrase root causes one more time, I might slit someone's throat, because it's a bullshit argument to do nothing to improve these systems. And
I'm sure you got this not that far back in the day, 6-7 years ago, and you might have repeated it yourself like I did. We, as someone who's perhaps sympathetic to Bernie or at least some of his ideas or movement, we want the Nordic model, universal health care. We want investments in social services. We want a more egalitarian society. And I believe that a lot of your detractors or my detractors now will say, oh, I've changed. It's like, oh, you're completely different. It's like, no, actually, you look at Stockholm, look at Copenhagen, look at the Nordic model. They have 3 times as many police per capita than in many California cities. They have public services to deal with homelessness, to deal with mental health and addiction issues. They have a more interventionist state when it comes to open air drug markets, public crime. The state does not just allow this to fester and have society be harmed by these public ills. If you want the public good of a Nordic model, it comes with everything. Everyone's taken care of in their model. For whatever reason, this kind of anarcho-capitalist version of society that is, take society and let's drain it, let's drown it in the bathtub. If you dress it up with the right social justice language, suddenly it becomes part of the progressive left, even though it does not comport at all with the Nordic model that I think you and I still basically agree with.
Oh, totally. I mean, I definitely agree with the Nordic model. I haven't changed my mind on that. I mean, there might be some tweaks necessary, but overall, the general like social programs, the criminal justice system, obviously there are privatized businesses in these countries, but you also have, socialized programs where it matters the most, like healthcare, for instance. I still believe in all of that. What has changed, though, is, I guess you need to catch up, Lee. You really do. It turns out that the Nordic model is a very racist model. The left thinks that it's actually terrible to want to pursue that type of society now. I don't know why they think it's racist. I think that's crazy. But I would.
Transphobic. Most of the Nordic countries have halted their childhood, gender transitioning programs.
Oh, that's right. Yep.
So that it's a hateful society.
Right. I guess that might be the reason why they're saying this. I don't know. But either way, clearly what they have implemented in these countries has been working far better than anything that we've done here. And the idea that now we need to look down our noses at Nordic countries as if we have a better solution is hilarious to me. It's just nonsense. So look, I hate using phrases that have become popularized, things like, oh, I didn't leave the left, but the left left me. But there is some truth to it because the Nordic model was something that was celebrated by the left and now it's not celebrated. So I don't know what that means. Like, I don't know what the left even represents at this point.
I think it's there's a style of West Coast progressivism which actually has been around for a while, but now it's become sort of ascendant in America. It didn't used to be. So like, basically I think we're all kind of New Deal Democrats, I guess. Like just
Yes, yeah.
Statist. We believe in institutions. That doesn't mean that we don't acknowledge that there are excesses in the criminal justice system, in the mental health care system, whatever. And the state can play a very destructive role. But for the most part, there's like the traditionally on the left in America, I think there's been an instinct that the way you solve social problems is by creating institutions to fix those problems. That's literally what progressivism is. And on the West Coast, that's like, because I grew up in California, and that's not always been the instinct of the left. I think it's not that new here. It's just new insofar as it's like that same attitude now prevails in DC and New York, and it didn't used to. But there was always this sort of like libertarian element to West Coast progressivism. The radical element was anarchist, not communist, right? Because they were like anti-statist, so they were so they didn't trust the communists for good reason. They were anarchists. They didn't trust any state institutions. There's this. So I think that there's this. I've read about this. That there's this confluence of like big state, nanny state kind of liberalism, and then this like libertarian, anti-statist progressivism that converge into something completely incoherent in California. And it becomes like at its extremes, it just becomes nihilism. It's just like, well, there's no solution to these problems, or maybe the problem isn't a problem actually at all. Like, what's wrong with drug addiction?
Maybe the problem's good.
Yeah, maybe
Yeah.
Drugs are good actually. We should turn over downtown to drug users. So this is like this like absolute, but it comes from a complete lack of faith in our ability as a society to be able to do anything.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And, it's interesting because when it comes to the right wing, I remember a common criticism, in fact, a current criticism, is this idea of defunding certain government programs like public education to the point where it starts to fail. And then you'll have the Republicans point to it and be like, it's failing. See, public education's failing. On the left, you have a version of that. So what's one of the things that local government actually gets celebrated for and does really well? Like parks and recreation. People love parks. When I look at a park that's well maintained and I see kids playing sports and having a good time with their families, doing a picnic, like I look at that and say, that's government working, right? That's something that has been provided to the community through our tax dollars. But when
I look at that and I go, this would be a great place for a homeless encampment.
but then you have these
out of here.
Then you have these radicals or anarchists, wanting to have a hands-off approach when it comes to open air drug markets within these parks. And what do you think that does to the mindset of the local community? Well, our government can't do anything, right? Our institutions continue to fail us. They can't even get a park correct. Like they're just letting this park be overrun with drug use and crime and all of that. So I just think that as the pendulum swings, and I do see it swinging, I really hope that those who have the right intentions, like they want to do the right thing, see where we went wrong, and hopefully the same mistakes don't get made in the future. But I think we're going to have to go through, unfortunately, like a pretty right-wing era in America before the left has another opportunity to solve some of the societal ills that, still exist. It's just that they were not appropriately dealt with when progressives had some power.
Yeah, whatever happened to public beauty? Like, you don't have the most gorgeous home or living space, but you could go out into the public square and be
Hmm.
somewhere comfortable and safe and maybe beautiful. Like the WPA has left this legacy of gorgeous monuments and art, public art all over California, all over the country. But this idea of public beauty is gone from progressives. And if anything, they celebrate kind of urban decay in a
Hmm.
way that's very dark. I don't get it. I honestly
Yeah.
don't.
I don't either. And, on one hand, they'll complain about how atomized Americans are, but then they'll celebrate like the destruction of public spaces where people in the community get together and, you know, communicate, socialize, play sports, whatever it is. People, when crime increases or when dysfunction in society becomes a real issue, people are more likely to just stay home. They're not going to want to go out. They're not going to go for a walk. They're not going to go to a park. They're not going to do any of that stuff. And so these are real issues. And I think the contradictions within the left have not been dealt with. And if anything, anyone who encourages them to deal with those contradictions, they're, you guys know from personal experience, right? They're treated as if they're pariahs and have terrible intentions when
I've seen some of the hate that you've received. I probably have only seen a fraction of it, but it's very frustrating for me. It really upsets me because it's so bad faith. It's so angry. It's like they hate you much more than they hate the right or anyone associated with Trump or
yeah.
any Republican figure. There's it's kind of maybe a common dynamic where apostates are hated more than anyone else, but still, I don't think you're an apostate. You're kind of just calling things out the way you see them, and that it's still from a point of concern for the public interest.
Right.
Just because you're not repeating the party line, that's why you're hated.
Yeah, and I either just tell people what they want to hear and constantly feel disgusted with myself, or I do what I feel is necessary to draw attention to the issues that I see. I'm going to go with the latter. I just think I don't want to feel disgusted with myself, and I don't want to mislead people and encourage them to continue supporting policies that are actually making their lives worse. So,
Well, I want to be respectful of your time and thank you again for coming on and thank you for your courage and bravery. We didn't get a
yeah.
chance to really talk about Israel, but I'm afraid if I open that up, we'll talk another
We'll have
45
end
minutes
back.
or so. Yeah.
Well, I'd love to have you guys on once I launch my podcast. Thank you for having me. And, I feel the same way about both of you. I've felt solace in following the work that you guys do because there are very few of us who are willing to call out our own side on some of these issues. And so keep doing what you're doing. I really, really appreciate it.
Well, if folks are listening, and hopefully we're going to grow this pod, but for folks listening, subscribe to Anna's new Substack. Check her out on YouTube. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.